Pistols blazing at high noon wasn't as scary as the whispers that followed Pearl McAllister through the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs. The year was 1876, and the Arizona Territory was as unforgiving as the tongues that wagged whenever she passed by. "There goes that McAllister girl," they'd say, not bothering to lower their voices. Wild as a Mustang and twice as dangerous to handle. Pearl kept her chin high as she made her way to the general store, her worn boots kicking up dust with each determined step. At 22, she'd grown accustomed to the sidelong glances and hushed conversations. The daughter of a prospector who died chasing silver dreams and a mother who'd followed him to the grave shortly after, Pearl had been raising herself since she was 16, working whatever jobs she could find and living in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters," Pearl said politely as she entered the store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. The older woman barely acknowledged her greeting, instead focusing intently on rearranging already perfectly aligned cans of beans. "I need some flour, sugar, and coffee if you have it," Pearl continued, pretending not to notice the slight. "Payment up front," Mrs. Winters said coldly. "Last time your credit was rather slow in coming." Pearl felt her cheeks flush but reached into her pocket and counted out the coins. "I pay my debts, Mrs. Winters, always have." HMPH was the only response she received as the shopkeeper gathered her items. The door chimed again, and several women from the town's social committee entered, their conversation halting abruptly when they spotted Pearl. "Mrs. Bennett, Mrs. Holloway," Pearl nodded politely. "Pearl," Mrs. Bennett replied stiffly before turning to Mrs. Winters. "We've come to discuss the arrangements for the harvest dance. It's going to be quite the affair this year." "Oh yes," Mrs. Holloway added with a meaningful glance at Pearl. "We're hoping to introduce some of the eligible young ladies to the new ranchers who have settled nearby. It's important to showcase our towns, proper young women." Pearl gathered her purchases, understanding the implication all too clearly. She wasn't considered proper. Not since she'd been caught skinny dipping in the creek with Johnny Wilkes when she was 17. Not since she'd punched the banker's son for trying to steal a kiss behind the schoolhouse. And certainly not since she'd started taking odd jobs at the saloon, serving drinks when they were short-handed. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Pearl said, heading for the door. "Ladies." Outside, Pearl took a deep breath of the hot, dry air. It didn't matter what they thought. She didn't need their approval or their invitations to silly dances. She was doing just fine on her own. But as she walked back toward her cabin, she couldn't help the small ache that bloomed in her chest. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she wondered what it might be like to have someone to share her life with. Someone who saw beyond the town gossip. Someone who might think she was worth loving. On the far side of town, a cloud of dust announced the arrival of a small group of riders. 3 men on horseback made their way toward the livery stable, their clothes and faces showing the wear of a long journey. "Finally," the tallest of the men said, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his brow. "I was beginning to think we'd never reach civilization." "If you can call this civilization," another replied with a chuckle. "Looks pretty quiet to me, Elias." Elias Dawson surveyed the town with keen blue eyes. At 28, he'd spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the most successful cattle drivers in the territory. With the money he'd saved, he'd purchased land near Cottonwood Springs, planning to establish his own ranch. "It's perfect," he said, a smile playing at his lips. "Quiet is exactly what I'm looking for." As they dismounted in front of the livery, a boy of about 12 came running out to greet them. "You looking to board your horses, mister?" the boy asked eagerly. "That we are," Elias replied, handing over the reins. "And we could use directions to the hotel if there is one. Sure thing." "The Cottonwood Inn is just down the street. Can't miss it," the boy said, gesturing. "You fellas new in town?" "Just arrived," Elias confirmed. "I've bought the old Miller property outside of town, planning to turn it into a cattle ranch." The boy's eyes widened. "That's a mighty big spread." "You'll need hands to work it." "That I will," Elias agreed. "Know anyone looking for work?" "Maybe," the boy said thoughtfully. "There's Miss McAllister. She can ride and shoot better than most men around here, but nobody will hire her for real work on account of her being a woman." Is that so? Elias said, his interest piqued. Yep, she does odd jobs all over town, helps out at the saloon sometimes too, which makes the church ladies all fired up. They say she ain't proper, but my pa says she's just trying to survive. Elias nodded, filing away the information. What's your name, son? Tommy, sir. Tommy Dawkins. Well, Tommy, I appreciate the help. Maybe I'll look up this Miss McAllister. After getting their horses settled and checking into the hotel, Elias and his companions, Frank and Harvey, made their way to the saloon to get a drink and a hot meal. The Three Aces Saloon was relatively quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few patrons scattered about. Behind the bar, a large man with an impressive mustache was polishing glasses. "Afternoon, gentlemen," the bartender greeted them. "What can I get you?" "3 whiskeys and whatever you're serving for supper," Elias replied, settling onto a bar stool. As the bartender poured their drinks, the batwing doors swung open and Pearl entered, carrying a basket of clean linens. "Got your tablecloths and napkins, Max," she called out, heading toward the bar. Elias turned at the sound of her voice and found himself looking into the most striking pair of green eyes he'd ever seen. They belonged to a young woman with auburn hair tucked under a practical hat, wearing a simple blouse and skirt that had seen better days but were spotlessly clean. "Much obliged, Pearl," the bartender replied, taking the basket. "Mrs. Potts has been asking for you. Says she needs help with her laundry since her rheumatism is acting up." "I'll head over there tomorrow," Pearl promised. She glanced at the 3 newcomers, nodding politely before turning back to Max. "Any chance you need help tonight? I could use the extra money." Before Max could answer, the saloon doors opened again and a group of cowhands entered, making a beeline for the bar. "Looks like I might," Max said with a smile. "Can you start now?" Pearl nodded, moving behind the bar to stow her things. As she did, Elias couldn't help but notice the graceful way she moved, efficient and purposeful. "You must be Miss McAllister," Elias said when she returned to take their orders. Pearl looked at him with surprise. "Have we met?" "No, madam." "Tommy at the livery mentioned you might be looking for work." "Did he now?" Pearl replied, a hint of wariness in her expression. "And what kind of work would that be?" "The honest kind," Elias said with a smile. "I've just purchased land outside of town, planning to start a cattle ranch. I need capable people who know the area." Pearl studied him for a moment. "And you think I'm capable?" "Tommy seems to think you can ride and shoot with the best of them." A small smile played at her lips. "Tommy's a good kid, tends to exaggerate though. So you can't ride or shoot?" Elias challenged, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't say that," Pearl replied, her chin lifting slightly. "I can do both quite well, actually." "Then I'd like to offer you a job," Elias said, extending his hand. "Elias Dawson." Pearl hesitated, looking at his outstretched hand. "People around here have certain ideas about me, Mr. Dawson. You might want to ask around before you make any offers." "I prefer to form my own opinions, Miss McAllister." Their eyes locked for a moment, and Elias saw a flash of something vulnerable behind her confident facade. "Pearl." Max called from down the bar. "These gentlemen need serving. Think about it," Elias said as she moved away. "I'll be around." As the evening progressed, Elias found his attention continually drawn to Pearl. She moved efficiently among the tables, handling the increasingly rowdy crowd with ease. When one cowhand got too familiar, trying to pull her onto his lap, she twisted free with a warning that was both polite and firm. "She's something, isn't she?" Frank commented, noticing Elias's interest. "She certainly is," Elias agreed. Later, as the saloon began to empty, Elias approached Pearl again as she wiped down tables. "My offer stands," he said. "I could use someone who knows the territory to help me get established. The pay would be fair." Pearl looked up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Why me, Mr. Dawson?" "There are plenty of men in town looking for work." "Because Tommy says you're the best, and from what I've seen tonight, you're not afraid of hard work," Elias replied honestly. "Plus, I suspect you know this land better than most." Pearl studied him, as if trying to determine his true intentions. "I was born here," she finally said. "I know every creek and canyon for 20 miles. "Then you're exactly who I need," Elias said with a smile. "What do you say?" Pearl hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I say I'll think about it. Where can I find you if I decide to accept?" I'm staying at the Cottonwood Inn for now, room 3, or you can find me at the Miller property starting tomorrow. I'll be there assessing what needs to be done. Pearl nodded. I know the place. Good water supply, decent grazing land. Sounds like you've already started the job, Elias said with a grin. For the first time that evening, Pearl smiled genuinely, and Elias felt something shift in his chest at the sight. Good night, Mr. Dawson, she said, turning back to her work. Good night, Miss McAllister. The next morning, Pearl woke before dawn, as was her habit. As she prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and leftover biscuits, she found herself thinking about Elias Dawson and his job offer. Working on a ranch would be preferable to the piecemeal jobs she cobbled together now. The pay would likely be steadier, and she enjoyed being outdoors far more than serving drinks or doing laundry. But there was something about the way Elias had looked at her that made her uneasy, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in years. After finishing her chores, Pearl made her decision. She would at least go talk to him about the specifics of the job. She could always turn it down if it didn't feel right. Saddling her mare, a sturdy paint named Pepper, Pearl rode out toward the old Miller property. It was a beautiful piece of land, with rolling hills that gave way to a creek-fed valley. The house and barn had fallen into disrepair after Old Man Miller died, but the bones were good. As she approached, she could see Elias and his companions walking the property, gesturing and discussing something. Elias spotted her first, raising a hand in greeting. Miss McAllister, he called as she dismounted. I was hoping you'd come by. I wanted to hear more about this job before I make any decisions, Pearl said, tying Pepper to a hitching post. Of course, Elias replied. Let me show you around and I'll explain what I have in mind. For the next hour, they walked the property while Elias outlined his plans for the ranch. He wanted to start with a small herd and gradually build it up, focusing on quality breeding stock. He needed help repairing the buildings, establishing proper grazing rotation, and eventually driving cattle to market. You seem to know what you're doing, Pearl commented as they circled back to the house. I've been working cattle since I was 14, Elias replied. Started as a ranch hand in Texas, worked my way up to trail boss and saved every penny I could. This place is the result of all that work. Pearl nodded, impressed despite herself. And what exactly would my role be? To start, I need help getting the place livable and the fences repaired. Then I'll need someone who knows the local terrain to help me establish the best grazing patterns. Once we get cattle, there'll be the usual ranch work, branding, herding, the occasional drive to market. All things I can do, Pearl confirmed. I figured as much, Elias said with a smile. So, are you interested? Pearl took a deep breath. What's the pay? Elias named a figure that was more than fair. In fact, it was considerably more than she made from her current assortment of jobs. And I'd live where? She asked. There's a small cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house, Elias said, pointing to a structure partially hidden by trees. It needs some work, but it would be yours as part of your compensation. Pearl considered the offer. It was more than generous, which made her suspicious. Mr. Dawson, I feel I should be direct. In my experience, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is. What exactly are you expecting from me in return for such generous terms? Elias's expression grew serious. Honest work, Miss McAllister. Nothing more, nothing less. I pay well because I expect the best and I reward loyalty. If that's not something you're interested in, I understand. Pearl studied him, looking for any sign of deception. Finding none, she nodded slowly. When would you want me to start? A grin broke across Elias's face. How about today? We've got a lot of work ahead of us. I need to collect my things from my cabin in town first, Pearl replied. Take Frank with you, Elias offered, gesturing to his friend. He can help you move your belongings. By nightfall, Pearl was settling into her new cabin on the Dawson Ranch. It was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and enough room for her modest possessions. As she unpacked, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. This was a new beginning, a chance to prove herself based on her abilities rather than the town's perception of her. Over the next few weeks, Pearl worked alongside Elias, Frank, and Harvey to transform the neglected property into a working ranch. They repaired fences, mucked out the barn, and made the main house habitable again. Each evening they would gather for a meal, often cooked by Pearl, who discovered that Elias was hopeless in the kitchen. "This is delicious," Elias said one evening as they sat around the table, enjoying a rabbit stew Pearl had prepared. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," Pearl replied, a hint of sadness in her voice. "Before she passed, she taught me everything she knew about running a household, said a woman needed to be self-sufficient." "Wise woman," Elias commented. "She was," Pearl agreed. "She also taught me to ride and shoot, much to my father's dismay. He thought those were skills for boys." "And what did your mother say to that?" Elias asked, genuinely curious. A small smile played at Pearl's lips. "She said that in this territory, everyone needed to know how to defend themselves and put food on the table. Being a woman didn't change that." "I think I would have liked your mother," Elias said softly. "She would have liked you too," Pearl replied before she could stop herself. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, something warm and unfamiliar fluttered in Pearl's chest. The moment was broken when Frank started telling a story about a cattle drive gone wrong. But Pearl caught Elias watching her several times throughout the evening, his blue eyes thoughtful. As the days passed, Pearl found herself enjoying Elias's company more than she cared to admit. He was fair, hardworking, and treated her with a respect she wasn't accustomed to receiving. He valued her opinion and often sought her advice about the local terrain or weather patterns. One afternoon, as they were repairing a section of fence on the north side of the property, a group of riders approached. Pearl recognized them immediately as some of the town's prominent citizens, including Mrs. Bennett and her husband, the banker. "Mr. Dawson," Bennett called out as they drew near. "We thought we'd come out and welcome you properly to Cottonwood Springs." Elias straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "That's mighty kind of you folks. I appreciate the welcome, Mrs." Bennett's gaze shifted to Pearl, and her friendly expression cooled noticeably. "I see you've already met some of our local residents." "Yes, Miss McAllister has been invaluable in helping me get the ranch established," Elias replied, either missing or choosing to ignore the woman's tone. "Has she now?" Mr. Bennett said, raising an eyebrow. "Well, that's interesting, Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Bennett said, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a discreet level. "Perhaps we could have a word in private. There are certain aspects of our community that newcomers might not be aware of." Pearl felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She knew exactly what Mrs. Bennett wanted to tell Elias about her. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Miss McAllister," Elias replied firmly. "She's my employee and has earned my trust." Mrs. Bennett looked flustered. "Well, I merely thought you should know that in Cottonwood Springs, we value certain standards of propriety, especially for young women. Some individuals have reputations that might not align with those standards." Elias's expression hardened. "Mrs. Bennett, I judge people by their actions and their character, not by town gossip. Miss McAllister has proven herself to be hardworking, honest, and knowledgeable, exactly the qualities I value in an employee." There was an uncomfortable silence before Mr. Bennett cleared his throat. "We've actually come to invite you to the harvest dance next Saturday. It's a town tradition, and as a new property owner, your presence would be most welcome." "That's very kind," Elias said, his tone warming slightly. "Will the invitation extend to my ranch hands as well, including Miss McAllister?" The Bennetts exchanged glances. "Of course," Mrs. Bennett finally said, though her smile appeared strained. "All are welcome." After they rode away, Pearl turned to Elias. "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" he asked, picking up his hammer to resume work on the fence. "Defend me. Include me in the invitation." Elias looked at her seriously. "Pearl, I meant what I said. I don't care about gossip or what happened before I got here. I care about who you are now, and from what I've seen, you're someone worth standing up for." Pearl felt a lump form in her throat. It had been a long time since anyone had shown her that kind of loyalty. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elias nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "So will you go to the dance?" Pearl hesitated. The last time she'd attended a town social, she'd been 18, and the experience had been less than pleasant. The other girls had whispered behind her back, and the boys had made crude suggestions. I don't think that's a good idea, she finally said. Why not? Elias pressed. You saw how Mrs. Bennet looked at me. That's how most of the town feels. They don't want me there. But I want you there, Elias said simply. As my employee and my friend. The word warmed Pearl more than it should have. I'll think about it, she conceded. The day of the harvest dance arrived, and Pearl still hadn't decided whether to attend. She was in her cabin, mending a tear in her work shirt, when a knock sounded at her door. Opening it, she found Elias standing there with a package in his hands. Afternoon, Pearl, he said with a smile. May I come in? Pearl stepped aside, suddenly conscious of her humble surroundings. Of course. Elias entered, glancing around the cabin with interest. Pearl had made it as homey as possible, with a colorful quilt on the bed and wildflowers in a jar on the table. I brought you something, Elias said, holding out the package. For the dance tonight. Pearl took it cautiously. What is it? Open it and see. Unwrapping the brown paper, Pearl gasped. Inside was a dress of deep green fabric, simple but elegant, with a matching ribbon for her hair. Elias, I can't accept this, she said, running her fingers over the soft material. Why not? He asked. Consider it a bonus for all your hard work. Pearl shook her head. It's too much. It's not, Elias insisted. Besides, I had a selfish motive. I was hoping it might convince you to come to the dance tonight, as my guest. Pearl looked up, surprised. Your guest? Yes, Elias confirmed, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she'd never heard before. I'd be honored if you'd accompany me. Pearl felt her resolve weakening. The truth was, she'd been thinking about Elias more and more lately, in ways that went beyond their working relationship. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the deep timbre of his laugh, the strength and gentleness of his hands as they worked side by side. All right, she finally said. I'll go, but don't say I didn't warn you when the whole town starts talking. Elias's face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip. Let them talk. We'll give them something worth talking about. That evening, Pearl stood in front of the small mirror in her cabin, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The dress fit perfectly, the deep green bringing out the color of her eyes and complementing her auburn hair, which she'd left loose except for the sides, which were pulled back with the ribbon. Another knock at the door announced Elias's arrival. When she opened it, the look on his face made all her anxiety worthwhile. Pearl, he breathed, taking in the sight of her. You look beautiful. Pearl felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself. Elias had traded his work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his best trousers. His hair, usually tousled by the wind, was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his beard. Shall we? He asked, offering his arm. Pearl hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. We shall. The town hall had been transformed for the harvest dance, with autumn leaves and corn stalks decorating the walls and tables laden with food along one side. A small band played lively music, and several couples were already dancing. As they entered, Pearl felt the familiar sensation of eyes turning in her direction, conversations halting. But this time, with Elias at her side, she found she didn't mind as much. Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Bennet greeted them, her smile faltering slightly as she noticed Pearl. How? Lovely to see you both. We're so glad you could join us. The pleasure is ours, Elias replied smoothly. It's a beautiful event. You and the committee should be proud. Yes, well, Mrs. Bennet said, clearly flustered. Please enjoy yourselves. There's plenty of food and drink. As she hurried away, Elias leaned down to whisper in Pearl's ear. See, that wasn't so bad. Pearl couldn't help but laugh. She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Then my evening is already a success, Elias replied with a wink. Would you care to dance? Pearl hesitated. I'm not very good. It's been a long time. Neither am I, Elias admitted. We can be bad at it together. And so they danced, awkwardly at first, but with increasing confidence as the evening progressed. Elias was a better dancer than he'd let on, and Pearl found herself relaxing in his arms, enjoying the music and the warmth of his hand at her waist. During a break in the dancing, they helped themselves to refreshments and found a quiet corner to sit. Having fun? Elias asked, his eyes twinkling. More than I expected, Pearl admitted, though I'm not sure everyone is happy to see me here. Indeed, throughout the evening, she'd noticed the whispers and stares, particularly from a group of young women who kept glancing their way. "Don't mind them," Elias said, following her gaze. "They're just jealous because I'm dancing with the prettiest girl in the room," Pearl scoffed. "Now you're just being ridiculous." "Am I?" Elias asked, his expression suddenly serious. "Pearl, do you have any idea how remarkable you are?" Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Bennett and several other men. "Dawson," Bennett said jovially, "some of us were just discussing the possibility of a cattle consortium. With your experience, we'd value your input." Elias glanced at Pearl apologetically. "Would you excuse me for a few minutes?" "Of course," Pearl replied, understanding that these connections could be important for the ranch's success. As Elias walked away with the men, Pearl found herself alone. She was considering getting another cup of punch when Mrs. Holloway and several other women approached. "Pearl," Mrs. Holloway said with a tight smile, "what a surprise to see you here." "Mr. Dawson invited me," Pearl replied evenly. "Yes, we noticed," another woman, Mrs. Davis, said. "He seems quite taken with you." There was something in her tone that made Pearl's defenses rise. "He's a good employer." "Is that all he is?" Mrs. Holloway asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because it looks like more from where we're standing." Pearl felt her cheeks flush. "I don't see how that's any of your business." "It becomes our business when it affects the reputation of our town," Mrs. Davis said coldly. "Mr. Dawson is a respectable businessman who doesn't know your history." "And what history would that be?" Pearl asked, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "Don't play innocent," Mrs. Holloway sniffed. "Everyone knows you're not the kind of girl men marry. You might have Elias Dawson fooled for now, but he'll figure it out eventually. Men like him don't end up with women like you." Pearl felt as if she'd been slapped. Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "And what kind of woman would that be, Mrs. Holloway?" Elias had returned, his expression thunderous as he stepped to Pearl's side. Mrs. Holloway had the grace to look embarrassed. "Mr. Dawson, we were just having a friendly chat with Pearl." "It didn't sound friendly to me," Elias replied coldly. "In fact, it sounded like you were insulting a woman I hold in very high regard." The women exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We merely thought you should know," Mrs. Davis began. "I know everything I need to know about Pearl McAllister," Elias interrupted. "She's intelligent, hardworking, and has more integrity in her little finger than I've seen in this entire town. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe this is our dance." Taking Pearl's hand, he led her back to the dance floor as a slower tune began to play. Pulling her gently into his arms, he looked down at her with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Pearl nodded, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. "I told you this wasn't a good idea." "No, it was a perfect idea," Elias contradicted her. "Now I know exactly who in this town is worth knowing and who isn't." As they swayed to the music, Pearl felt both exposed and protected in Elias's arms. "What did they mean? You know everything about me," Elias sighed. "Bennett took it upon himself to fill me in on your supposed scandals, swimming in the creek as a girl, working at the saloon, living alone without a chaperone." Pearl stiffened. "And that doesn't bother you?" "The only thing that bothers me is how this town has treated you," Elias replied, his voice fierce. "Pearl, I've known women who have worked cattle drives, run saloons, even robbed banks. Your so-called scandals wouldn't raise an eyebrow in most places I've been." Pearl searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, she felt something tight inside her begin to loosen. "Why are you so different?" she asked quietly. Elias considered her question seriously. "I suppose because I've seen more of the world than most folks here. I've learned that people are rarely what others say they are. You have to take the time to know someone yourself." "And do you think you know me, Elias Dawson?" Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm learning," he replied with a small smile, "and I like what I'm discovering." The music ended, and they stood for a moment, still in each other's arms until the start of a livelier tune broke the spell. "Would you like to leave?" Elias asked, noting the curious glances still being directed their way. Pearl nodded gratefully. "I think I've had enough socializing for one night." Outside, the October air was crisp, and Pearl shivered slightly in her thin dress. Without a word, Elias removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, pulling it closer around her. It smelled like him leather and pine, and something uniquely Elias. They walked in comfortable silence back to where their horses were hitched, the moon lighting their way. As Elias helped Pearl onto her mare, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I meant what I said in there," he told her softly. "You're remarkable, Pearl McAllister." Before she could respond, he mounted his own horse, and they rode back to the ranch side by side. The next morning, Pearl woke to the sound of rain pattering on her cabin roof. After the events of the previous night, she was grateful for the excuse to stay in. She needed time to sort through her feelings about Elias and the things he'd said, but by midday, there was a knock at her door. Opening it, she found Elias standing there, rain dripping from his hat. "Thought you might be getting cabin fever," he said with a grin. "I brought lunch." He held up a basket, and the smell of fresh bread wafted toward her. "Come in," Pearl said, stepping aside. "You're soaked." "It's coming down pretty hard," Elias agreed, removing his hat and coat. "Thought we could use the day to go over some plans for the ranch, if you're up for it." Pearl nodded, taking the basket and setting it on her small table. "I'll make some coffee." As she busied herself with the coffee pot, she was acutely aware of Elias moving around her small cabin, examining the few personal items she had on display: a carved wooden horse her father had made, a faded daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. "You like to read," Elias observed, picking up the book. "When I have time," Pearl replied. "My mother taught me. She believed education was important even for girls." "Especially for girls, I'd say," Elias commented, setting the book down carefully. "My sister was the same way. Always had her nose in a book." "You have a sister?" Pearl asked, realizing how little she knew about his family. "Had," Elias corrected gently. "She died of scarlet fever when she was 16. That was 10 years ago now." "I'm sorry," Pearl said, understanding the loss all too well. "Thank you," Elias replied. "She was a lot like you, actually. Independent, stubborn, smarter than most of the boys her age, which drove them crazy." Pearl smiled at the description as she poured coffee into 2 cups. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Elias agreed, accepting the cup she offered. "My parents never really recovered from losing her. They still live in Texas on a small farm. I send them money when I can." They settled at the table, and Elias unpacked the basket, revealing fresh bread, cheese, and preserved fruit. "This looks delicious," Pearl said, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. "Mrs. Johnson at the hotel packed it for me," Elias admitted. "I told you I'm hopeless in the kitchen," Pearl laughed. "At least you admit it." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily between them. Elias shared stories of his cattle driving days, the characters he'd met on the trail, and the adventures he'd had. Pearl found herself laughing more than she had in years. In turn, she told him about growing up in Cottonwood Springs, the beautiful hidden places she'd discovered in the surrounding hills, and her dreams of someday seeing more of the world. "Why haven't you left?" Elias asked curiously. "If the town has treated you so poorly, what's kept you here?" Pearl considered the question. "It's home," she said finally. "For all its flaws, it's the only place I've ever known. My parents are buried here, and I guess part of me has always hoped that eventually people would see me for who I really am, not who they think I am." "And who are you, really?" Elias asked softly. Pearl met his gaze. "Just a woman trying to make her way in the world, not as wild as they think, but not as tame as they want me to be either," Elias smiled. "I like that description." After they finished eating, Elias spread out some papers on the table: plans for expanding the barn and adding a corral for breaking horses. "I thought we might add a few quarter horses to the operation," he explained. "Good cow ponies are always in demand. And from what I've seen of your riding skills, you'd be perfect for training them." Pearl looked at him in surprise. "You'd trust me with that?" "I can't think of anyone better," Elias replied seriously. "You have a way with horses, they respond to you." Pearl felt a warm glow of pride at his confidence in her. As they bent over the plans together, their heads nearly touching, she was intensely aware of his proximity, the clean scent of his soap, the warmth radiating from his body. "What do you think?" He asked, looking up suddenly, his face inches from hers. I think it's a good plan, she replied, her voice slightly breathless. Elias held her gaze, and for a moment Pearl thought he might kiss her. But then he straightened, clearing his throat. Well, I should probably head back to the house, he said, gathering the papers. The rain seems to be letting up. Pearl nodded, ignoring the pang of disappointment she felt. Thank you for lunch and the company. At the door, Elias turned back to her. Pearl, about last night. I hope you know that what those women said doesn't matter to me. I know, she replied softly. Thank you for that. He hesitated, as if there was more he wanted to say, but then simply nodded. I'll see you tomorrow. Weather permitting, we'll start on the new corral. As Pearl watched him walk back toward the main house, she admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Elias Dawson. The next few weeks were busy ones at the Dawson Ranch. With winter approaching, there was much to do to prepare for the colder months. Elias purchased a small herd of cattle at a nearby auction, and Pearl helped drive them back to the ranch, impressing Elias and his men with her skill. The relationship between Pearl and Elias had shifted subtly since the night of the dance. There was a new awareness between them, a tension that was both exciting and unsettling. Their hands would brush as they worked together, and lingering glances were exchanged across the dinner table. Yet neither of them spoke of it, as if by mutual agreement they were waiting for something, though Pearl wasn't sure what. One crisp November morning, Pearl was in the barn, tending to a mare that had recently come up lame when Elias entered. How is she? He asked, coming to stand beside Pearl. Better, Pearl replied, running her hand along the horse's leg. The swelling's gone down. Another few days and she should be sound again. Good, Elias said, then hesitated. Pearl, I need to talk to you about something. There was a seriousness in his tone that made Pearl straighten, suddenly anxious. What is it? I need to go to Denver, Elias explained. There's a bank there that's willing to extend me a loan to expand the herd come spring, but I need to sign the papers in person. Oh, Pearl said, relief washing over her. When do you leave? Tomorrow, Elias replied. I should be back within 2 weeks, weather permitting. I was hoping you'd be willing to oversee things while I'm gone. Frank and Harvey know the routine, but I'd feel better knowing you were in charge. Pearl was touched by his trust. Of course, I'll make sure everything runs smoothly. I know you will, Elias said with a smile, then he reached into his pocket. I almost forgot, I have something for you. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. I was going to save this for Christmas, but since I'll be gone for a couple of weeks, I thought I'd give it to you now. Pearl took the package, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a beautifully tooled leather journal with her initials PM embossed on the cover. Elias, she breathed, running her fingers over the soft leather. It's beautiful. I noticed you like to write sometimes, he said, looking slightly embarrassed. I thought you might enjoy having a proper place to put your thoughts. Pearl was deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Elias had noticed something about her that few others ever had: her habit of jotting down observations and thoughts on scraps of paper. Thank you, she said softly. I'll treasure it. Elias reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. I'll miss you, Pearl, her heart hammered in her chest at his touch. I'll miss you too. For a moment they stood close, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then the mare nickered, breaking the spell, and Elias stepped back. I should finish packing, he said. I'll leave at first light. Pearl nodded, clutching the journal to her chest. Safe travels. The next morning, Pearl was up before dawn to see Elias off. He looked handsome in his travel clothes, his saddlebags packed and ready. Remember, if there's any trouble, Sheriff Cooper in town is a good man, Elias told her as he mounted his horse. And the money for supplies is in the top drawer of my desk. We'll be fine, Pearl assured him. Just focus on getting those loan papers signed and coming back safely. Elias looked down at her, his expression softening. 2 weeks, he promised. Take care of yourself, Pearl. You too, she replied. As she watched him ride away, Pearl felt a strange emptiness settle over her. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. True to her word, Pearl kept the ranch running smoothly in Elias's absence. Each evening, she would write in the journal he had given her, documenting the day's events and increasingly her feelings for him. As the days passed, Pearl found herself counting down to his return, anticipating the moment when she would see him riding up to the ranch. On the 12th day after Elias's departure, Pearl was in town picking up supplies when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Did you hear about the robbery on the Denver road?" One man was saying to another outside the general store. "Stage was held up 3 days ago. 2 passengers killed." Pearl froze, her heart pounding. Elias would have been on that road, possibly on that very stage. "Excuse me," she interrupted the men. "Do you know who was hurt?" The men turned to her with surprise. "No, madam," one replied. "Just heard there were casualties. The sheriff might know more." Pearl hurried to the sheriff's office, fear gripping her heart. Sheriff Cooper looked up as she burst through the door. "Miss McAllister," he greeted her. "What can I do for you?" "I heard about the stage robbery," Pearl said breathlessly. "Elias Dawson is on his way back from Denver. I need to know if he was involved." The sheriff's expression grew somber. "I received a telegram about the incident. 2 men were killed resisting the robbers. A third was wounded and taken to a doctor in a town called Fairplay." "Do you have names?" Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let me check," Cooper said, rifling through papers on his desk. "Here it is. The deceased were a James Wilkerson and a Peter Morgan. The wounded man," he scanned the paper, "was identified as an Elias Dawson." Pearl felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. How badly was he hurt? "It doesn't say," the sheriff replied, looking at her with sympathy. "Just that he was taken to Dr. Thomas in Fairplay for treatment." "I need to go to him," Pearl said immediately. "How far is Fairplay?" 3 days hard ride, Cooper told her, "and the weather's turning." "There's snow in the mountains." Pearl straightened her shoulders. "I don't care, I'm going." Before the sheriff could object further, Pearl was out the door. She returned to the ranch only long enough to pack supplies and inform Frank and Harvey of what had happened. "You can't go alone," Frank protested. "It's too dangerous." "I have to," Pearl insisted. "Elias would do the same for any of us." In the end, Harvey agreed to accompany her while Frank stayed to look after the ranch. By mid-afternoon, they were on the trail, pushing their horses as fast as was safely possible. The journey was difficult, just as the sheriff had warned. The weather grew increasingly cold as they climbed into the mountains, and on the 2nd day, snow began to fall. Pearl's fingers and toes were numb with cold, but she refused to stop for more than brief rests. Late on the 3rd day, they reached Fairplay, a small mining town nestled in a high mountain valley. Pearl immediately sought out Dr. Thomas's office, her heart in her throat. The doctor, a graying man with kind eyes, looked up as they entered. "Can I help you?" "We're looking for Elias Dawson," Pearl said, her voice hoarse from the cold. "He was wounded in a stage robbery, brought here for treatment." Dr. Thomas's expression softened. "Ah, Mr. Dawson, yes, he's here." "Are you family?" "I work for him," Pearl replied. "We came as soon as we heard." "How badly is he hurt?" "He took a bullet to the shoulder," the doctor explained. "Lost a fair amount of blood and there was some infection, but he's past the worst of it now. With proper care, he should make a full recovery." Relief washed over Pearl, making her knees weak. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "He's in the back room, been asking for someone named Pearl." "Would that be you?" Pearl nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "Yes." "Go on in then, doctor." Thomas said with a smile, "He'll be glad to see you." Pearl entered the small room, her heart pounding. Elias lay on a narrow bed, his shoulder bandaged, his face pale but his eyes open. When he saw her, a look of disbelief and joy spread across his face. "Pearl," he whispered, "is it really you?" She moved to his side, taking his hand in hers. "It's me. We heard about the robbery. I had to come." Elias squeezed her hand weakly. "You rode all this way, in this weather?" "Of course I did," Pearl replied, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I was so afraid I'd lost you." Elias reached up with his good hand, gently wiping away her tears. "It'll take more than a bullet to keep me from coming back to you, Pearl McAllister." Pearl leaned down, resting her forehead against his. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." "I'll do my best," he promised, a small smile playing at his lips. Over the next several days, Pearl rarely left Elias's side. She helped change his bandages, made sure he ate, and read to him from books borrowed from the doctor's personal library. At night, she slept in a chair beside his bed, waking at the slightest sound to check on him. As Elias regained his strength, they talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams they hadn't before. Pearl told him about her parents, about the lonely years after their deaths, and her determination to survive despite the town's judgment. Elias spoke of his childhood in Texas, his sister's death, and his years on the trail, searching for a place to call home. "I think I've found it," he told her one evening as they watched snow falling outside the window. Not just the ranch, but home. The way he looked at her as he said it made Pearl's heart flutter. "I hope so," she replied softly, a week after Pearl's arrival in Fairplay, Dr. Thomas declared Elias fit enough to travel, though he would need to be careful with his shoulder for several more weeks. "The weather's cleared," Harvey reported. "If we take it slow, we should be able to make it back without too much trouble." The journey back to Cottonwood Springs was indeed slower than their frantic ride to Fairplay had been. They stopped frequently to allow Elias to rest, and Pearl watched him like a hawk for any signs of fatigue or fever. At night, as they camped under the stars, Pearl would sit close to Elias, ostensibly to help keep him warm, but increasingly because neither of them wanted to be apart. On the third evening of their journey, as they sat by the campfire after Harvey had gone to sleep, Elias took Pearl's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what happened, about how close I came to never seeing you again." Pearl swallowed hard. "I try not to think about that." "But we should," Elias insisted, "because it made me realize something important. Life's too short to waste time dancing around feelings that matter." Pearl's heart began to race. "What are you saying, Elias?" He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. "I'm saying that getting shot made a few things very clear to me. One of them is that I don't want to spend another day pretending I'm not in love with you." Pearl's breath caught in her throat. "You're in love with me, completely," Elias confirmed, a small smile playing at his lips. "Have been for a while now. I just didn't know if you felt the same, or if you'd even want to hear it given your independent nature." Pearl laughed softly, tears of joy threatening to spill. "For someone so smart, you can be remarkably dense, Elias Dawson. Of course I love you. Why else would I ride through a snowstorm to find you?" Elias's smile broadened, and he reached up to cup her cheek. "I was hoping that might be the case." Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. Pearl responded eagerly, wrapping her arms carefully around him, mindful of his injured shoulder. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and Elias's eyes had darkened with desire. "When we get home," he said, his voice rough, "I'd like to court you properly, if you'll let me." Pearl smiled, resting her forehead against his. "I think that ship has sailed, Mr. Dawson. We're well past courting at this point," Elias chuckled. "Perhaps you're right. In that case, would you consider marrying me instead?" Pearl pulled back slightly, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt. Finding none, she felt a joy so intense it was almost painful spread through her chest. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "The town, to hell with the town," Elias interrupted firmly. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I love you, Pearl McAllister. I want to build a life with you. Say you'll be my wife." Pearl's answer was another kiss, deep and promising. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their return to Cottonwood Springs caused quite a stir. News of Elias's injury had reached the town, and several people, including the Bennetts, came out to the ranch to check on him. Their surprise at finding Pearl caring for him and the unmistakable affection between them was evident. "Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Bennett said stiffly after observing Pearl adjust Elias's sling with familiar ease. "We're relieved to see you recovering. If you need anything, a proper nurse, perhaps." "I have everything I need, Mrs. Bennett," Elias interrupted politely but firmly. "Pearl has taken excellent care of me. In fact, I owe her my life." "Yes, well," Mrs. Bennett replied, clearly uncomfortable. "That's very commendable of her." "It is," Elias agreed. Then, with a glance at Pearl that made his feelings clear, he added, "But then, I've always known what a remarkable woman I was fortunate enough to employ. And now, even more fortunately, to marry." The silence that followed his announcement was deafening. Mrs. Bennett's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "Mary," she repeated weakly. "You and Miss McAllister are engaged?" "We are," Elias confirmed, reaching for Pearl's hand. "The wedding will be in the spring once my shoulder's fully healed." The news spread through Cottonwood Springs like wildfire. Reactions were mixed, with some expressing genuine happiness for the couple and others barely concealing their shock and disapproval. "Let them talk," Elias told Pearl when she expressed concern about the gossip. "Their opinions don't change how I feel about you." As the winter deepened, Elias's shoulder healed and the ranch settled into a routine. Pearl moved her things into the main house, though they maintained separate bedrooms until the wedding, more for propriety's sake than from any personal conviction. Working together, they continued to improve the ranch, planning for the spring cattle drive and discussing their future. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, often simply enjoying each other's presence. One snowy evening in January, as they sat together on the sofa, Elias brought up something that had been on his mind. "Pearl," he began, his arm around her shoulders, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She looked up at him, a small frown of concern crossing her face at his serious tone. "What is it?" "It's about the ranch," Elias explained. "I've been thinking that it needs a name. Not just the Dawson place or the old Miller property, but something that's ours." Pearl smiled, relieved. "You're right, it should have a name." "I was hoping you might have some ideas," Elias continued. "You know this land better than I do. What would you call it?" Pearl considered for a moment, looking out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "When I was a girl," she said slowly, "I used to ride up to the ridge on the north side of the property. In the spring, it's covered with wildflowers, paintbrush, and columbine and lupine. My mother used to call it the Wildflower Ridge. How about Wildflower Ranch?" Elias smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Wildflower Ranch," he repeated. "I like it. It suits you, wild and beautiful and stronger than people give you credit for." Pearl laughed, snuggling closer to him. "Are you comparing me to a flower, Mr. Dawson?" "Maybe I am, Mrs. Almost Dawson," he replied with a grin. "Got a problem with that?" "Not at all," Pearl said, reaching up to kiss him. "I rather like it." As spring approached, preparations for the wedding began in earnest. To Pearl's surprise, many of the townspeople who had once whispered behind her back now offered congratulations and assistance. Perhaps Elias's obvious devotion to her had changed some minds, or perhaps they simply recognized the inevitable and decided to make the best of it. The ceremony was held on a perfect April day, with wildflowers indeed carpeting the ridge behind the ranch house. Pearl wore a simple white dress, her hair adorned with a crown of columbine and lupine. Elias, fully recovered from his injury, stood tall and handsome in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Pearl as she walked toward him. The entire town turned out for the occasion, along with Elias's parents, who had traveled from Texas to meet the woman who had captured their son's heart. Mrs. Dawson, a gentle woman with Elias's blue eyes, had embraced Pearl warmly. "Our Elias has always had good judgment," she told Pearl the night before the wedding. "If he chose you, then you must be something special indeed." As Pearl and Elias spoke their vows before the minister, the love between them was palpable. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Elias pulled Pearl into a tender kiss, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more goodwill than Pearl had experienced in Cottonwood Springs in years. Late in the evening, as the party continued around them, Elias led Pearl away from the crowd, up to the Wildflower Ridge. In the moonlight, the flowers were silver and blue, swaying gently in the spring breeze. "Happy?" Elias asked, pulling Pearl close. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, looking up at the stars. "If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here as your wife, with half the town celebrating our marriage, I'd have said they were crazy." Elias laughed, the sound warm in the night air. "Life has a way of surprising us." "That it does," Pearl agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "But this is one surprise I'm very grateful for." "As am I," Elias said softly, lowering his lips to hers. Their kiss was long and deep, filled with promise for the future they would build together at Wildflower Ranch. When they finally broke apart, Pearl rested her head against Elias's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What are you thinking?" Elias asked, stroking her hair. Pearl smiled, thinking of all the changes the past year had brought. "I was thinking about what Mrs. Holloway said at the harvest dance, about how men like you don't end up with women like me." Elias frowned. "She was wrong." "I know," Pearl agreed. "But it's funny how people decide who's wife material and who isn't, based on such silly things." "Well, I happen to think you're perfect wife material," Elias said, tilting her face up to his. "In fact, I can't imagine a better wife if I tried." "Is that so?" Pearl teased. "Absolutely," Elias confirmed. "You're strong, smart, brave, and you love this land as much as I do. What more could a man want in a partner?" "When you put it that way," Pearl said with a smile, "it sounds like you got a pretty good deal." "The best deal of my life," Elias agreed, pulling her close again. "And I intend to remind you of that every day for the rest of our lives." As they walked back down to their home, to the first night of their married life, Pearl felt a sense of peace and belonging she had never known before. The girl who wasn't wife material had found a man who saw her true worth, who loved her not despite her independence, but because of it. And together, they would make Wildflower Ranch thrive, proving to everyone, but most importantly, to themselves, that sometimes the most unexpected matches make the strongest bonds of all. 5 years later, Pearl stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Elias taught their 3-year-old daughter, Emma, to ride her first pony. The little girl, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair, sat proudly on the gentle Shetland, her face a picture of concentration as Elias led the pony around the yard. "Look, Mama," Emma called excitedly. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see that, sweetheart," Pearl called back with a smile. "You're doing wonderfully." In her arms, Pearl held their second child, 6-month-old James, named after Elias's father. The baby gurgled happily, reaching up to grab at Pearl's necklace, a silver wildflower pendant Elias had given her on their first anniversary. Wildflower Ranch had flourished under their care. The herd had grown, and their reputation for quality cattle and well-trained horses had spread throughout the territory. They employed several hands now, and had expanded the house to accommodate their growing family. Cottonwood Springs had changed too. The railroad had finally come through, bringing new people and new opportunities. Pearl was now a respected member of the community, serving on the school board and helping to organize the town's first lending library. Mrs. Bennett had eventually come around, especially after Pearl had helped nurse her through a difficult bout of pneumonia 2 winters ago. Mrs. Holloway had moved away, but Mrs. Davis had become, surprisingly, one of Pearl's closest friends, once she'd taken the time to know the real woman behind the gossip. As Elias finished the riding lesson and lifted Emma from the pony, the little girl ran to Pearl, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Did you see me, Mama?" "Papa says I'm a natural, just like you." "He's right," Pearl agreed, smoothing her daughter's wind-blown hair. "You're going to be an excellent horsewoman." Elias approached, taking James from Pearl's arms and placing a kiss on his wife's cheek. "Just like her mother," he said with a wink. "Wild and free and perfect, just as she is." Pearl leaned into his side, contentment filling her heart as she looked at their home, their children, the life they'd built together. From the Wildflower Ridge to the creek that marked their southern boundary, every inch of this land held memories now of struggles overcome, of joys shared, of a love that had defied expectations. "I love you, Elias Dawson," she said softly. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Elias's arm tightened around her waist. "I love you too, Pearl Dawson, and I always will." As the sun began to set over Wildflower Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the family made their way inside. To the warmth and love of the home they had created together, a home built on respect, understanding, and the unshakable belief that sometimes the person everyone says isn't wife material turns out to be exactly perfect after all.